This is Killer Innovations, a show about ideas, creativity, and how you can innovate. Welcome to the Innovator's Garage, where you learn to create your next game-changing killer innovation.
Welcome to Killer Innovations. This is your host, Phil McKinney. We are back here in the studio. And this week, we are actually continuing a conversation with a guest today that I actually had up at an event that I host up in Keystone, Colorado every year. And we invite speakers to come in from the outside to actually present to this audience, of about 500 or so technologists from around the world. Today's guest is Safi Bahcall. Safi is the author of a book called Loonshots: How to Nurture the Crazy Ideas That Win Wars, Cure Diseases, and Transforms Industries. Now, just to give you a little background on Safi, he's a second-generation physicist. That had to be interesting dinner conversations. I'm sure we'll get into that. And a biotech entrepreneur. He went to Harvard, did his PhD at Stanford. He's an ex-McKinsey person. I will not hold that against him. And he led the IPOs. He served as CEO for a biotech company doing work in cancer research. In 2011, he worked with President Obama's Council of Science Advisors on the future of national research. And for those of you who have been longtime listeners to the show, know that I am a big, big proponent of the role of government and national research programs and support for ideas that would not get commercialized in a traditional kind of funding model. So with that, Safi, welcome to Killer Innovations.
Thanks, Phil. Delighted to be on your show.
Hey, and I also wanted publicly to extend appreciation for you to take time out of your schedule to come all the way up to 9,100 feet elevation to lovely Keystone, albeit everybody hangs out at the oxygen bar up there. So, hey, real quick, your book is called Loonshots. Now, Loonshots is not a term that I had ever heard until I read your book. So can you give us, as we kind of start into the conversation today, what your definition of a loonshot is?
Sure. Well, everybody knows what a moonshot is. It's a big goal that has a lot of enthusiasm and support. But if you look back at history, of the course of history, the big ideas that change the course of science, business, or even nations rarely arrive with blaring trumpets and red carpets, dazzling everybody with their brilliance. Usually they're dismissed, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, and their champions are written off as crazy. And since there wasn't a good word in the English language for that, I just made one up.
Well, and it's kind of, the unwritten rule, right, in the innovation game, that if you're not called crazy, then your idea is not really a big enough idea, right? If you look at the history of people who got classified as being the crazies out there.
Yeah, in fact, the original word for moonshot came from when John F. Kennedy declared his intention to Congress in 1961. We put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And he was, of course, widely applauded. But what people don't realize is that 40 years earlier, a man named Robert Goddard suggested the ideas that would get us to the moon: liquid-fueled jet propulsion, in other words, rocket flight. And when Goddard suggested that in the 1920s, he literally was written off as crazy. The New York Times wrote an editorial essentially saying, this guy doesn't understand anything of what he's talking about. And for 40 years, he was dismissed. Although, interestingly, that was in the US, but it was not in Germany. German scientists took his ideas seriously, and they built the first jet engines, the first jet aircraft, the first long-range missiles. Fortunately, World War II ended before the Germans could press that advantage. But the moral of that story is that declaring moonshots is a nice thing to do, but nurturing loonshots, those crazy ideas, is absolutely critical.
Yeah, but what's your position on are those kinds of moonshots? Are they always dependent on some kind of loonshots that came before them? Like you talk about Goddard and jet, propulsion and, flight and those kinds of things. Is there a pattern to those loonshots occurring before kind of the moonshot type of thing?
Yeah, I mean, you can think of the moonshot as a destination, and you can think of nurturing loonshots as how you get to that destination. So it's a good idea to declare where you're going and what you're trying to achieve. But really, the important thing is nurturing those crazy ideas. So, for example, Let's talk about the transistor. It's probably the most important invention, as you and I'm sure, agree, of the 20th century. Nobody said, let's make a switch that's based on a solid state device. That's a giant. Nobody said that. They just had a bunch of people nurturing crazy ideas that people said couldn't be done, challenging accepted wisdom. Now, they did have a moonshot there, which is they wanted to send a phone signal from New York to San Francisco. That was the version of the moonshot 100 years ago. And of course, at the time, that was impossible. They could barely transmit a signal from city to city, even a fraction that distance, because quantum mechanics had not yet been invented and the electron had just been discovered. So it was a pretty crazy goal for the time. But the way they got there was nurturing loonshots, doing all those things that conventional wisdom said were impossible. And then three guys in 1947 actually found that you could make this sort of switch that worked as a semiconductor, out of semiconductors, yeah.
So are these kinds of transitions that occur across these loonshots, in the book you refer to them as phase transitions. So describe a little bit about what you mean by the science of this phase transition.
What I talk about there is, why is it that good teams will kill great ideas? Why is it, for example, almost everybody used a Nokia phone at some point. It was they were selling half the smartphones in the planet, as you and I both know. They were far more dominant in market share than Apple is today. And at some point, that same team that had converted Nokia from this conglomerate that made toilet paper and rubber boots in the 60s and 70s into the leading technology company of that era. They were number one they were actually the largest company by market cap in Europe at 300 billion. Those same groups, that same leadership team, listened to a project proposal of, hey, let's make a much bigger phone. In 2004, let's make a big phone with a nice big screen. And here's another crazy idea, Loonshot. Let's put a store in the internet where you can download these things. We'll call them applications. That same leadership team killed that idea. And that same engineering group watched 3 years later on a stage in San Francisco as Steve Jobs got up and unveiled the iPhone. And within a few years, Nokia was toast. So why is it that good teams kill great ideas? And what I get to, that point that you mentioned, the phase transition, is it's not about the individuals. It's people. Good teams with the best intentions and excellent people will kill great ideas. Why? To understand that, think about a glass of water. You have a bunch of molecules. You can stick your finger in, you can slosh your finger around, and then as you rotate, as you turn down the temperature, all of a sudden the behavior of those molecules completely changes. You can't stick your finger anymore. The water suddenly freezes. But they're exactly the same molecules. So why did their behavior change so suddenly? And so that's kind of part of the research of the book, as I show why that happens inside teams. There's no CEO molecule that's standing in the water that's saying, everybody line up and be rigid. Okay, no, wait a minute, it's 31, it's 33 degrees, everybody slosh around. There's no CEO molecule telling them what to do. Something happens, certain things change, certain control parameters change, and their behavior changes. And so that's kind of what the book is about. It's not so much about what the CEO says. There are certain properties of groups that make them suddenly switch from embracing wild new ideas to becoming Nokia and rigidly rejecting them. So that's what makes it, that's called a phase transition in science. And so what the book is about why groups have those phase transitions.
Yeah, well, what you're, and I'm sitting here as a CEO, and now you're telling me I'm not important. Yeah, we're going to talk more about specifically the characteristics that you've identified in the book that lead to these, are you bouncing around and fluid, or do you, lock down and become rigid? And it's interesting from the standpoint of, after I read your book and you came up and you spoke at our conference, and I sat back and I looked across my career, having done, started off 5 people at a company called Telligent. We took that public. We grew that to $3 billion. And I could see the transition as it went through that 5-year journey of, back of an envelope to now being a public company to now being this big entity. And like you said, though, it wasn't somebody standing up saying, we will hereby be or hereby do. It's that underlying And for lack of a better term, I would use culture. Then I went to Hewlett Packard and had a completely different experience at HP in a much larger organization that was much more supportive of the innovation efforts. But but I could never put my finger on what was happening underneath the covers until I read your book. So when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Safi Bakal, the author of Loonshots. You're not going to want to miss this because I want to talk specifically about what are those characteristics of those phase shifts that either support the Loonshots or that kill those Loonshot opportunities. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this quick commercial break. You're listening to Killer Innovations on the BizTalk Radio Network. Welcome back to Killer Innovations. We are continuing our conversation with Safi Bakal, the author of Loonshots. Hey, Safi, we went to commercial break. We were talking about, or at least I was lamenting the fact as a leader, what is my role? Are these phase transitions just inevitable, or what can I as a leader do or what should I be doing differently than what we traditionally think a leader's role is when it comes to these kinds of activities?
Right. So that's a great question. I get that all the time. So what can you do? If you have these phase transitions and the molecules that change and people that change, what can you do about that? And so the thing that makes this so interesting and so important is that once you understand kind of what are the forces at work and what that phase transition is, you can begin to manage it. For example, you sprinkle salt on your sidewalk when it snows overnight. Why? Because it lowers the binding energy between molecules and makes them less likely to stick. So when you step on your sidewalk, you wet your foot in a puddle. What's the point of that story? Once you understand the transition, you can begin to control it. You lower the melting temperature. The same thing with people with people inside companies, with leaders inside companies. So here's what I mean by that. And here's what I talk about with folks. And we talked about a little bit when we were at Keystone, which is the ice cube, the garden hoe, and the heart. And since I have a terrible verbal memory, I just can't remember words. I just think of it visually, and that helps me remember. Those three tools, those are tools, mnemonics, for the rules that help you achieve the one exception to the rule, that a liquid will always freeze, that a company as it gets larger will always ossify. And the one exception to that rule is life at 32 Fahrenheit. That's the one exception where a system can be in two phases at the same time. The sort of the rigid order, discipline, execution that you need to build products on time, on budget, on spec, but also the fluid craziness supporting wild, crazy ideas. And the job of the leader is to achieve that balance between the artists, let's call them, the creatives, the innovators, the designers who are coming up with these wild Loonshots, and the soldiers who are turning them into those little concepts that you deliver on time, on budget, on spec. So that's the first part, is the ice cube, is to understand that you have those two, to separate those roles where possible, if not by person, then at least by time. Your artists, your soldiers, they usually won't like each other. And that's okay. They don't understand each other. They speak different languages. One loves risk, one hates risks. And that's exactly what you want. That conflict is a good thing. It's a perfect thing. You want one group who's pushing crazy ideas to take a lot of risk. Otherwise, your competitor will, and you'll be surprised. And you want the group that's turning it into products you deliver on time, on budget to customers to reduce risks. So the job of the leader, number one, is to understand and separate those functions and create two different systems. Number two, the garden hoe. And by garden hoe, I mean lead as a gardener, not as a Moses. There's this myth that you and I know of the great innovative leader as this big Moses, like the myth of Steve Jobs, which is such a false myth. Stands on the top of the mountain, raises his or her staff, anoints the chosen Loonshot, the holy project, the iPod or whatever, and everybody just parts the seas and it just happens. And that's actually just total bullshit. What really happens, the great leaders, as you and I both know, lead much more like a gardener. They manage the touch and the balance between those artists and the soldiers, because the soldiers rarely want to take the new idea out. They're busy. They're paid on commission. They don't want to learn the crazy new thing. So your job as a leader is to manage that transfer, take those baby stage ideas out, not too early, not too late. And the soldiers who resist, help them get comfortable, create the right incentive systems, the right structure, the right culture, the right processes to manage the transfer, because that's the failure point of most innovations you and I know. It's not in the supply. You put 10 people in a room for an hour, you get 1,000 ideas. Some of them which will be good. The failure point is the transfer between the artists and soldiers, because you need both. So the job of the good leader is, number one, to understand you have these two things. That's Ice Cube. Number two, the garden hoe. Lead more like a gardener, managing the touch and the balance, getting the feedback. As you know, version 1.0, version 2.0 of some new product or idea or software or tool never works. And the soldiers don't really care about giving the feedback going back into lab because they're busy. They're paid on commission. It takes time out of their day. They don't want to show the new thing to the customer and ask them what the problem is, because that customer gets annoyed. So your job as a leader is, number one, those two things. Number two, the garden hoe, manage the transfer. And number three is probably the most important, the heart. And that is love your artists and soldiers equally. And this is why it's so difficult, especially for people who, let's say, like you and me, come up from the technology side. We may love other technology innovators. And then the soldiers who are actually doing the hard work of turning a new concept into a product and getting it on time, they feel really demotivated. If they sense that from the leader, they're really demotivated. I have a friend who puts out a major magazine every 30 days, and she talks about how the leadership team is always, going on about whoever's squeaking the loudest about some shiny, innovative toy. And she says, how does that make us feel? The 95% of us who are putting out a magazine every 30 days. And so when the leader leaves the room and the person who's squeaking about the latest innovative toy, are they going to cooperate? No, because they're pissed off at each other. They don't like each other. The job of the leader is that Ice Cube understand that there are those two things, the garden hoe to manage the delicate transfer between them two, and the heart to make sure both sides feel loved equally.
Do you come across situations where a person can be an artist and a soldier?
Absolutely. Now, if you think to smaller companies, and that's very tricky, because most people try to think of themselves as one or the other. So, for example, Steve Jobs, when he first started at Apple, saw himself as this ultimate artist. And he, said, oh, everybody who's the innovator is the, is the pirate working on the new Macintosh is great. And all these other soldiers, regular Navy doing the Apple franchise are bozos. And, the hostility he created was so bad. The street between their two buildings was called the DMZ, and everybody left. And the Mac, when it launched, was kind of a flop, and the Apple franchise suffered. So that was an example of someone who saw himself early on as just an artist. But as he matured years later, he understood that both things were important, and he developed both sides of himself. So I think especially if you're at a small company, you don't have the bandwidth to have separate teams doing both. If you're an individual like me writing a book, you have to have your creative side, but you have to deliver things on time. So individuals have to be both. And the way you do that, you have different hats. I literally have one hat for artist, one hat for soldier, and you just have to be conscious of which hat you're wearing when.
Yeah, and I think you're using the book as the analogy, having written my own book, and going through the whole process of, oh my God, I got to get my 75,000 words out, in time and make sure I deliver it to the publisher at time. At the same time, dealing with, some crazy artist trying to come up with a jacket cover at the same time. What is the graphic going to look like on the front? So, Safi, we're going to take a quick commercial break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation talking about Safi's new book, Loonshots, How to Nurture the Crazy Ideas That Win Wars, Cure Diseases, and Transform Industries. We'll come back, we'll get into some examples of some of those crazy loonshots that Safi has in his book. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. You're listening to Killer Innovations on the BizTalk Radio Network. Welcome back. We're continuing our conversations with Safi Bahcall, the author of Loonshots. Now, Safi, we talked in the last segment about what can leaders do. The question I've got is a lot of our listeners for the show are also individual innovators, highly creative people coming up with the idea, whether they're inside of an organization or they're doing it on their own. They've got the side hustle thing going. What would be some things that individuals could do, and what are some examples of those?
All right, I'll give you 3 rules for individuals. We talk about 3 rules for leaders. I'll give you 3 rules for individuals. Number 1, I think of as LSC, listen to the suck with curiosity, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Number 2, mind the false fail, and I'll tell you the false fail of Friendster story that led to Facebook becoming a $100 billion plus company. And number 3, why you should ignore this horrible rule of fail fast and pivot. So I'll tell you those 3 things and maybe some drug discovery stories in there. So the first one, LSC, what do I mean? So I got that idea from a guy that I used to work with named Judah Folkman. So Judah was a chief pediatric surgeon at Boston Children's Hospital, chief of surgery there. And as a young guy, he came up with this idea of a new way to treat cancer. He had this idea because from the surgeries he did, he saw blood tumors covered with little blood vessels. He said, well, maybe we could block those blood vessels that feed tumors. Now, when he suggested that idea, he was written off as completely crazy because at the time, this was 30, 40 years ago, people said, well, there's only 2 ways. You poison tumors, that's chemotherapy, flood the body with poison, or you burn them, that's radiation therapy. This idea that tumors somehow are like homes and they grow these pipes that feed, bring in oxygen, that's absurd. Where's the signaling? So he worked for 32 years. He was dismissed until actually one day in Chicago, June 1, 2003, a guy got up on a stage and showed a slide and said, wow, the largest clinical trial ever done to date of patients with colon cancer, flipped a slide and showed patients who took Judah's drug, the drug based on his ideas, lived longer than anyone who ever survived. And that, she got a standing ovation. The guy actually said at the time, well, if only Dr. Folkman were alive to see this. Judah was actually sitting in the back, leaned over and just smiled and laughed. Loved telling that story. But LSC is something I got for Judah, which is all along the way. It's like one time a major lab talked to the Wall Street Journal, said, we can't reproduce Dr. Folkman's result. National headline. Famed cancer researcher stumbles, you can't reproduce his result. Instead of beating them up and attacking them, which is your usual reaction to hearing the suck or the bad, he called the guy up and very politely said, walk me through, help me understand what you're doing. He learned to listen to the suck every time there was a stumble, which is always when you're pursuing, rather than, dismissing or rejecting or attacking people that tell you it's a terrible idea. He leaned in. He not only just acknowledged it, but he got curious. He put on his Sherlock Holmes hat. Walk me through what it is you don't like. And that's very hard to do. When you're an entrepreneur and you're putting your heart and your soul into a baby, it's very hard. Your baby, beautiful idea. It's hard to hear that nobody likes your baby. It's hard to hear that they think your baby's ugly, but it's even harder to keep asking why. So that's kind of number 1, listen to the suck with curiosity. Number 2, which I got from Judah Folkman, and by the way, this drug transformed the treatment of cancer for the last 20 years. Number 2, mind the false fail. So when Zuckerberg was going around to raise money for Facebook, almost all investors blew him off because they had this idea that, well, they're just like fads. Because right around that time, Friendster was the 10th or 15th social network, and it had grown and grown and grown, and then people were leaving it for the next one, which was MySpace. And investors said, look, everybody's just leaving these social networks. They're bad business models, except for one guy, Peter Thiel, who went in and said, well, actually, I think Friendster's got a bad website. He went and he got the user retention data from Friendster, from friends of his who worked back there, and he found out actually, people were staying on that website, that social network called Friendster, for hours, even though the website was crashing every few minutes. It's like, how is that possible? And he realized it was a false fail. People were leaving not because the social network was a bad business, but they were leaving because these guys had a software glitch. That was the false fail of Friendster. So he wrote a check to Zuckerberg for $500,000, and he sold it 8 years later for $1 billion. So that's minding the false fail. The first one was listen to the suck for curiosity. The second one is understand whether a failure is really a flaw in your idea or is it a flaw in your experiment. That's the second one. And the third one is ignore this common mantra of fail fast and pivot. And here's what I mean. I'll give you another drug discovery story. The first guy this is a drug that probably saved more lives than any other drug in the last 30 years. And that was the discovery of the statins, the cholesterol inhibitors. We ran to probably 10 or tens of millions. I don't know. Do you take a statin?
No, but I know people who do.
About 30, 40 million Americans or so take statins. Saved probably millions or maybe tens of millions of heart attacks. The first guy who came up with the idea, Akira Endo, a Japanese scientist, he came up with this idea because there was this stuff 30, 40 years ago that high cholesterol is associated with lots of heart attacks. And he came up with this idea and he started trying to work on it. And then all these dietary trials of eat less eggs, they failed to show that any of that stuff worked. And so almost everybody gave up. That was an example of a false fail. But he persisted. The second thing, when he begged his supervisors to allow him, and they said, all right, fine, we'll give you another chance. And he finally found an early drug, and he did what you always do in biotech, and you give it in the laboratory, you test it on mice. That's the gold standard. He gave it to mice, nothing. Absolutely nothing happened. There were a few groups in the world still working on statins. Everyone gave up except for him. And what he did is he thought about it and said, I wonder if there's something specific about mice. And he went to a bar one night and he was getting drunk, and a buddy of his was working on chickens, using chickens as experiments. And they were getting kind of drunk. And he said, well, actually, you know what? Chickens lay a lot of eggs, and eggs have a lot of cholesterol. Maybe before you make those chickens into yakitori, before the end of the experiment and you eat them, you could just give them my drug. Boom. It worked incredible. It lowered the cholesterol immediately. And eventually people realized mice were just a bad test. They only have good cholesterol. Mice only have the HDL, the good cholesterol, and statins work by lowering the LDL. It's just a weird fluke. It turns out chickens and humans and dogs. And so he persisted. And because of that persistence, we have this drug that saved tens of millions, prevented tens of millions of heart attacks, saved millions of lives. So had you listened to Fail Fast and Pivot, we would have never had that drug. So those are the kind of three particular rules for innovators. Listen to the suck with curiosity. It's when you pull on that thread of all the negative stuff, at the end of that thread might be some gold nugget that helps save your project. Number two, mind the false fail. Make sure when something stumbles, it's not a flaw in your experiment, but it's really fundamentally testing your idea. And number three, ignore this fail fast and pivot. You want to learn fast, but you don't want to fail fast and pivot.
So here, I'm going to play the skeptic, because if I follow these three rules, I could rationalize myself to never stop a project. And there is at some point where you're like, okay, it's this thing's not going to work.
Absolutely. And actually, it was Judah Folkman, the guy who developed this, the blood vessel inhibitor drugs for cancer. It was a talk that I heard him give a couple times. How do you tell the difference between persistence and stubbornness? And for me, the litmus test is, am I doing LSC? When someone tells me my idea is dumb or an experiment doesn't work, do I write them off? Do I say, you're an idiot? Just get out of my way. When I'm doing that, I may have crossed the line. It's like an internal check. If somebody says, I'm not buying your idea, I'm not buying your project, this is stupid, and I ask them, my own internal gut reaction is, help me understand what's not working about. And you get really curious, then it's worth going. But if you've crossed that line, you've crossed the line from persistence to stubbornness. And so for me, that's a signal of when to give up.
And that's actually a perfect point, right? Because sometimes we just we fall in love with our ideas that we just never want to let go. We'll ride them. And you and I both probably run into lots of entrepreneurs who have ridden their horse way beyond where they should have, and they should have gotten off a long time ago, but they became so emotionally entwined with the idea that they can't take any outside input or any outside feedback. If it gets viewed as negative, then it's a reflection on that person and they're not listening. So great point. We're going to take another quick commercial break. When we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Safi Bakal, the author of Loonshots, How to Nurture the Crazy Ideas That Win Wars, Cure Diseases, and Transform Industries. And we'll be right back after this quick commercial break. Well, welcome back to Innovations. Let's wrapping up today's conversation with Safi Bakal, the author of Loonshots. Now, Safi, one of the questions or one of the things that's been rattling around in my head is, as a CEO myself and having been the CTO at Hewlett Packard, is the challenges of how do you balance, the size of the activities within the organization. You kind of got your core business. And in the case of HP, we had a separate, much smaller team, 30 people versus 240,000 people focusing on, quote, innovation work. How do you balance all that out? How do you make sure that you don't get skewed one way or the other?
I think that's a great question. I think when I think of job of the leader, the balancing is one of the most important things. And I think of that on two dimensions. One is balancing the size of the innovation or the loonshot that you're nurturing. And the other is balancing the type. So let's do the first one. So let's take an example of Google. I think of when you have a franchise, something that's working very well. At Google, their franchise was, of course, searching text in the early days. I think of that as your battleship, your core battleship. It's sailing down a lane. It's owning the lane. When you think of the small variations, let's say in Google's case, it's searching text. Well, now maybe you want to search images. I think of that as a speedboat. You leave, the mothership, and then if it may work, it may not work, and then it comes back. So that's a speedboat. The loonshot refers to something I think of as, let's say, a helicopter. You get off that battleship, you explore completely different lanes. Building a mobile phone operating system, for example. That's a totally different lane. That's a helicopter. So one thing that you really want to balance is your speedboats and your helicopters. You have your core franchise, that's your soldiers delivering stuff on time, on budget, on spec, your sales, your marketing. Of course, you want to innovate around that. If you're doing Google search, of course, you want to add Google, Google image search as well. But you need to be exploring helicopters because if a competitor does that, it could blow your ship out of the water. So you want to, on the one hand, one dimension is balance your small and your large, your speedboats and your helicopters. That's one dimension. A second one is much more subtle and much more strategic. And I think of that as balancing the two types of loonshots. What do I mean by that? The one type is a very familiar P type with product type. It's a new product, a new technology people say will never work. Way back when it was the telephone. Oh, that's a stupid idea. It never work. Or the transistor, or the CCD chip, or digital cameras. These are all new, or personal computers. That's new technology, you can't do it. The other is a small shift in strategy that involves no new technology. Think about Sam Walton. When he moved his store, he was a 32-year-old guy. He liked to sell stuff. He wanted to open a store in St. Louis, like a city. Where do you go when you sell stuff where there are people walking around? His wife just didn't want to live in a big city. She said, honey, I love you, but you know what? It's got to be a town less than 10,000. So Walton, had his dream, but he also liked being married. So he ended up moving to a small town. He also liked quail hunting. That's why he picked, Bentonville, Arkansas, because there are 4 states and Medium Point, 4 different quail seasons. And he moved his stuff and he opened a store there. There was no new technology. He didn't invent selling stuff. He just discovered that going to rural areas unlocked a strategy that no one had thought about. That's an example of an S-type loonshot, and it wiped out the retail industry. He took over. So those are P-type, those are S-type. And the reason that's so important is if you're just one or just the other, you're going to lose. I'll give you an example from the aviation industry. Some of your audience might remember Pan Am or might have seen Pan Am in movies. It's hard to imagine, but it was the number 2 most famous brand in the world. It was the most successful airline. There were Pan Am stewardesses they made a TV show about Pan Am stewardesses. Pan Am pilots were like rock stars of the day. It disappeared. Why? Well, the guy who really built Pan Am from nothing into what it became was a guy named Juan Trippe, and he was a P-type innovator, a phenomenal P-type innovator. And he saw the world as better, bigger, faster engines. Boom, 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 boom. And that had made Pan Am very successful. He launched the jet age, the first jet air, the 707, the Boeing 737, the Boeing 747. But eventually that fails. A competitor of his, much less well-known, a guy named Bob Crandall, didn't know anything about engines, didn't know anything about planes. He was a banking guy. He worked at Hallmark greeting cards. He came up with small changes in strategy. Hey, why don't we fly through hub and spoke model? Hey, why don't we do this thing called frequent flyers? Hey, why don't we take our reservation system and give it to every travel agent in the country? You can't do that. That's insane. That's crazy. Well, just watch me. Let me try it. Boom. That became the Sabre reservation system. And all these travel agents in the US started using American. And so guess what? When deregulation hit, when there was a big shock to the industry, Pan Am went down the toilet. And who survived? It was the S-type innovator. So the reason you want to understand that distinction is if most people are either one or the other. But if you become very good at both, you can be incredibly powerful. And an example that people think of Steve Jobs as this great product guy. Well, he also came up with the idea when everybody was saying music is free online, that is ridiculous. You want to put a music store. He said, screw that. Let me just try this weird strategy. There was no technology there. He said, let me sell songs for 99 cents. People are like, are you crazy? Boom, 7 million songs downloaded in the first 24 hours. At the time, Apple was like PCs. Everybody could clone them. And he said, you know what? No new technology. I'm just going to buy out. I'm going to write $100 million check and shut down all the clones. So the reason this is so important is that if you achieve balance, which is where we started, balancing the speedboats and the helicopters, the small and large, but also balancing the two types, strategy and product, you can go from being a pretty good innovator to a fantastic innovator.
And Savi, that's a great way to wrap up the show today. If people want to keep track of where you're writing, posting, what you're up to, what's the best place for them to see what you're up to?
Loonshots.com.
Perfect. We'll have that link and also the links to social media and everything over on the show notes. And so you want to hop over to killinnovations.com, pick up the show notes for this show, and we'll have all the information that Safi shared today to kind of give you a little bit of the crib notes. But having read his book, I would encourage all of you to go out, pick up Loonshots. It'll just change your whole perspective on what does it really mean to have those kinds of disruptive, emergent kind of innovations that have huge impact on people's lives. And Safi, I know you're busy with promoting your book. You're out on the road a lot, so I appreciate you taking the time and joining us here today.
Thanks. Delighted to be here, and thanks for having me on the show.